Hello everybody, I'm Sharmen, and I'm going to be talking to you today about invisible women, the representation of women from the Indian subcontinent by the East India Company. Now, the East India Company had a very long history. It was established by Royal Charter by Elizabeth I in 1600, so in the early 17th century. And she gave the company monopoly trading rights over India and in the East. And it was wound up in 1858, the year after the Indian Mutiny, when the administration and rule of India passed to the British government and Queen Victoria. That's what we now call the British Raj. So the East India Company was involved in India for over 250 years. And I'm going to be looking at the representation of Indian women in the last 150 years of that. But before that, I want to turn to something much more recent. Last Tuesday, I was at the Royal Festival Hall listening to a talk by Salman Rushdie. And in that, he described how when he was a student at King's College at Cambridge, reading history, his history tutor said something that he thought was very important about writing history. His history tutor said, "You should not write history until you can hear the people speak. You shouldn't write history until you can hear the people speak." And I thought that was very significant for the representation of Indian women by the East Indian Company, because we don't hear their voices speak very often. If you look at various histories and history books about the East Indian Company, you see the names and you read the names and the stories of Indian men, but you very rarely read about named Indian women. So in these histories of the East India Company, you'll read about the Mughal emperors who were ruling India at the time, Jahangir, Aurangzeb, Shah Alam, Bahadur Shah. You'll read about provincial rulers, the Sultans of Mysore, Hyder Ali, Tipu Sultan, the Nawabs of Bengal, Ali Vardi Khan, Siraj al-Dawla, Mir Jafar, Mir Qasim. You'll read about the rulers of Punjab, Ranjit Singh and Duleep Singh. You'll read in these histories about Indian businessmen and merchants, people like Amir Chand and Jagat Seth. You'll read about Indian shipbuilders like Lauji Wadia. But what you won't read in these histories, and what are rarely mentioned, are named Indian women. So just to give you a few examples, this book, The Honourable Company, A History of the East India Company by John Key, written in 1993, it's 400 pages long. It doesn't actually manage to mention a single named Indian woman, though there are references to unnamed ones. So we're told about the wife of Job Charnock. Job Charnock, some of you may know, was the East Indian Company official who founded Calcutta in the early 18th century. Key writes about Charnock's wife. He writes that Charnock snatched away a young Hindu girl from her husband's funeral pyre and now lived contentedly with the Sarid maiden. Now, we never learn the name of this Sarid maiden. Key also writes about the Nawab Farrukhzia, and he mentions Farrukhzia's formidable mother, but again, we're never given the name of the formidable mother. And Key also tells us that Englishmen in India often took a lower or half-caste woman to bed, but doesn't give us the names of these companions of East India Company men. Go on to another book, Raj, The Making of British India by Lawrence Jones. The first 300 pages of this book is actually about the East India Company. And again, this book very rarely refers to Indian women by name, though it does refer to Indian women. So we're told about the infant Punjab prince, Duleep Singh, and we're told that he had a nymphomaniac mother, but we're not told her name. He writes about the household management, how household management in India was an anxiety for East India Company officials, unless, quote, although those who kept a native mistress were relieved of most of its burdens, but we don't learn the names of these native mistresses who relieved these men of their burdens. And we're also told the story of Alexander Walker, an East India Company official who campaigned against female infanticide in Gujarat in the early 18th century. And when he rode through the area, Jones writes that he was greeted by grateful mothers holding up their baby daughters, but we're not told the names of those grateful mothers or indeed their daughters. Rarely, actually, Jones does mention one Indian noblewoman who fought against the British by name, and that's the Rani of Jhansi, who some of you may have heard of, Lakshmi Bai. One more. Oh, sorry. Hold on. Oh, right, sorry. It's a top one, thank you. IT is not my skill. Right, okay, so last book, The Corporation That Changed the World, by Nick Robbins, much more recent, 2012. Again, only one reference to women, the Queens of Awadh, and we're not told their names, no named women at all. Well, you may say, well, history is often the narrative of rich, prominent men. And these histories of the East India Company do refer to such Indian men, the Nawabs, the princes, and the merchants. Women are often absent from European histories. My daughter is studying history GCSE at the moment, and one of her topics is the history of medicine, from the Greeks to the formation of the NHS. And she told me last week, in tones of some disgust, that there was only one line on women in her textbooks which referred to the contribution of women. There's only one line in these textbooks on the contribution of women to medicine, which referred to Florence Nightingale as an anti-contagionist. So is the absence of women from the history books about the East India Company really any different from the absence or from the frequent absence of women in European histories? I'd argue yes, it is, because when these Indian women, named or unnamed, do appear in histories of the East Indian Company, the way they're represented reflects a particular set of ideas which European women aren't seen through. So one incident that turns up again and again in histories of the East India Company is the story that I've mentioned already, the story of John Charnock, the founder of Calcutta, and his wife, whom he rescued from being burnt on the funeral pyre of her first Indian husband. And the source generally quoted as evidence of this is Alexander Hamilton's 1927, A New History of the East Indies. And in this, Hamilton writes, "The country being overspread with paganism, the custom of wives burning with their deceased husbands is also practised here. Mr. Charnock went one time to see a young widow at that tragical catastrophe, but he was so smitten with the widow's beauty that he sent his guards to take her by force from her executioners. They lived lovingly many years and had several children." Now, one of the ways that societies who see themselves as civilised, distinguished, put themselves above societies that they perceive as less civilised is by the treatment of their women. And that's very apparent in East India Company officials' views of India in the 19th century. One way that the British justified their colonialism was by presenting it as a necessary intervention to bring India to similar levels of civilization to England. And you see this in James Mill's 1840, The History of British India, where he says, "The history of uncultivated nations uniformly represents the women as in a state of abject slavery, from which they slowly emerge as civilization advances. A state of dependence more strict and humiliating than that which is ordained for the weaker sex among the Hindus cannot easily be conceived." So the implication here is that it's the British who will help Indian civilization advance by, among other things, improving Indian men's treatment of Indian women. Now, Gayatri Spivak, who's a post-colonial theorist, describes this as a set of ideas which is the colonial fantasy of... Sorry.
I'll do this.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so it's the colonial fantasy of white men saving brown women from brown men. Now, the histories of the East Indian Company and the East India Company and the representation of women, whether as satis, women rescued from funeral pyres of their husbands, or mothers who are grateful to EIC officials who campaigned against female infanticide, essentially represent Indian women to support this colonial interpretation of uncivilized India being brought into a higher state of civilization by the British. And we see this narrative of white men saving brown women from brown men, even in histories which, superficially at least, are more sympathetic in their accounts of India in the 18th and 19th centuries. Thank you. The history I'm going to look at, some of you may be familiar with this, is William Dalrymple's White Moguls, which tells the love story of an EIC official, James Fitzpatrick. It's James Kirkpatrick, not Fitzpatrick. James Kirkpatrick, and his young Indian noblewoman, Khair Unnissa. And these two married and had 2 children. And Dalrymple sees this relationship as a triumph of what he calls cultural assimilation and hybridity. Now, at the time that the couple met, Khair Unnissa was actually promised in marriage to an older member of the Hyderabad nobility. But in the meantime, she'd seen and fallen in love with James Kirkpatrick. At least that's what his account tells us. He wrote a letter to his brother describing his first meeting at the end of the 18th century with Khair Unnissa, when he says that he first resisted her advances, writing, "I did once safely pass the fiery ordeal of a long nocturnal interview with the charming subject of this letter. She declared to me again and again that her affections had been irrevocably fixed on me." He goes on in this letter to describe another nighttime meeting when he writes, "But was it human nature to remain proof against another such fiery trial? She hinted that the sacrifice she was about to make me was the only chance of avoiding a hateful marriage. I think you cannot but allow I must have been something more or less than man to have held out any longer." So in these letters, James Kirkpatrick presents his love affair as very much in this pattern of a white man, him rescuing a brown woman, Khair Unnissa, from a hateful marriage arranged to a much older brown man. And William Dalrymple, the writer of White Moguls, doesn't question James Kirkpatrick's account. In fact, he says James Kirkpatrick certainly believed the girl had fallen in love with him. And it's worth noting that at this first meeting between the two, James Kirkpatrick was 32, Khair Unnissa was 14. And yet James Kirkpatrick presents himself as having been seduced by the girl, rather than, as their ages might suggest, the other way around. And this isn't an account that William Dalrymple questions. Now, to be fair to William Dalrymple, he acknowledges that as the letters that Khair Unnissa herself wrote had either disappeared or were destroyed, she can only be seen obliquely through the eyes of her husband, a later lover, her mother, her children, whose letters do survive. And this leads to another problematic issue when representing Indian women under the East India Company. On the one hand, when Indian women of this time are described, they're often presented through the views of how men in the East India Company felt that Indian women should be perceived, so they're seen as victims to be rescued. However, there are very few sources in the direct voices of Indian women to counteract these views. Khair Unnissa was an aristocratic Indian woman, and so she was literate. And although her letters were destroyed, but the majority of Indian women at this time were not literate. So Dalrymple, in his book, describes another relationship between a British man and an Indian woman. The man is William Hickey. He's a lawyer and diarist in 18th century Calcutta. And he formed a relationship with a Bengali woman called Jemdani. And she had earlier had a relationship with a colleague of his, and that colleague had returned to London. And Hickey describes in his diaries how he lived happily with Jemdani until her death in childbirth. And Dalrymple also presents letters from Hickey's friends praising Jemdani. And there's even a portrait of her commissioned by Hickey, which is the picture that I started the talk with. So this is a picture of them, Jemdani. But the one voice we never hear directly is that of Jemdani herself, possibly and probably because she was illiterate. So this then raises the question of how can the voices of these invisible women be presented when their own voices don't survive directly in sources such as letters or diaries. And the representation of them through the writings of their male partners presents them through a particular construction of Indian womanhood that formed the part of the British justification for colonising India. To return to Salman Rushdie's history tutor and his statement, how can we hear the voices of these women when we're writing their histories? A partial answer to this, I think, is in this book, The Untold Stories of the East India Company. It's a set of fictional stories of people involved with the East India Company based on historical research. It was part of a project written by a group of volunteers working with the Brick Lane Circle, of which I was one of those volunteers. Now, interestingly, over a quarter of these stories, so 5 out of 17 stories, are in the voices of Indian women who were involved with the East India Company. So some of these voices, such as that in Sita's Circle and the Gallery, tell the stories of companions of East Indian Company officials in those women's voices. Some of the stories describe the lives of Indian women who lived with Indian men. So the story Reading Between the Lines tells the story of an Indian noblewoman who was the sister of Nawab Ali Vardi Khan and the first wife of Mir Jafar, and that story is told in her voice. Another story, The Sound of Silence, tells the story of 2 Indian widows and how they manage their land and command an army in a predominantly male Indian world. And finally, in the story of The Blue-Eyed Girl, the mixed-race daughter of an English barrister and his Indian mistress tells both her story and the story of her Indian mother. So I think one way perhaps that we can hear the voices of these invisible women is through fiction. History often gives us an oblique glimpse into lives, but history can't always fully tell those lives because it depends on what Amitav Ghosh calls the evidentiary trail. Amitav Ghosh also goes on to say that fiction can, quote, integrate many different aspects of the world into a narrative. And I think that's very much what the stories in the voices of Indian women in this book do. They use historical sources, but they also use fiction to fill these evidentiary gaps, and they allow us to hear the voices of Indian women living at the time of the East India Company. Thank you.
Very much. Any questions, please? So whilst people are thinking, can I just go back to... She looks like she's holding a mobile in her hand.
Yeah, she does, doesn't she?
But I suspect it's a palm, because I think she's
Yeah, probably.
It's quite interesting. I had a question. At this time, when we are talking about the sort of the 18th century, 17th, 18th century, the first question that comes up is, yes, I can understand the first gentleman, he saw the woman on the sati, so they were able to see it. But a very large number of women would be in Purta. How would these men actually get to meet these?
if you read the White Mogul's book, there seem to be two types of liaisons. There were liaisons with these women, with aristocratic women, and they were political, those. There were political advantages, particularly at that time in India. The British didn't control everything. So say somewhere like Hyderabad, they didn't actually control, but they had interests in it. So they'd have an official there, what they called a resident, and the resident would form various alliances with people in the area. But one way of forming alliances was actually to form an alliance with a woman, a sexual alliance, essentially. What seems to have happened is we tend to see, zenanas as very backward places. Women can't go out. But actually, there's an argument for saying that particularly the postmenopausal women in those zenanas had a lot of power. They were the mothers of the Nawabs. And they exercised power from that, and sometimes they would actually put forward. I mean, this girl, Khairul Nissa, if you read, this is James Fitzpatrick's account, but he says that when she was first brought to him in this nocturnal meeting, she was in Purdah, and she was brought to him by her mother and her grandmother. Because it was I think things aren't maybe as black and white as we kind of think now. And there's another guy, William Palmer, who was the resident of Hyderabad. He also formed a relationship with an aristocratic Indian woman. And again, presumably she had been in Purdah at some point. Okay. Jemdani is different. I mean, there seem to have been two sort of sets of relationships. There were women, I think one of the writers I quoted says that English East India Company officials formed relationships with lower and half-caste women. Women like Jemdani, I mean, she'd been the mistress of one man and then moved on to being the mistress of another man. And that actually was a way, these women were often left money in wills, by their partners. It's interesting because, yes, they were victims, but also they were using, the limited agency that they had to, further their own interests.
Okay. Any other question? Just behind you, Evan.
Okay, so full disclosure before I ask this question, I am married to a white man and a brown woman, if you can't see me in the dark. And what I'm interested to know from you is this historical narrative. Between this and the elephants, I'm depressed, okay. I was hoping for something along the lines of a greater parity, perhaps Jemdani's story is slightly more optimistic. But how do you think that this is clearly a narrative that repeats itself even in current... I'm thinking of the Ballad of Mangal Pandey for one of those. There's a story there where the white lead rescues an Indian woman from the pyre. Is there any other narrative somewhere else that isn't this rescuing narrative? I mean, my husband's lovely, but he's not that great. Yeah,
I'm quite depressed myself, actually, because when I think about this narrative, it is something that does repeat itself now. When you think about... and this is actually something that I was thinking about, the Rotherham paedophiles, yeah? The emphasis on that is their race, right? There are plenty of white paedophiles, yeah? White men are not blamed for that, They are paedophiles. These men are brown paedophiles, and there's a subtext underneath that somehow, the countries they come from treat women in a certain way, and therefore these men are paedophiles. And that is very depressing, because this is a narrative from, the 18th century when Britain was a colonial power that is essentially still being repeated today. So I'm afraid there probably are some more cheerful narratives, but I think this is certainly a narrative that's alive and kicking today. Okay.
Good. There's one in the back.
Really, it is just a question. I can't help feeling that there must be some kind of tradition of burlesque theatre or storytelling in which there are dominant women.
You're absolutely
probably
right.
not with white men.
You're absolutely right. I mean, this is only talking about Indian women in relation to white men. Obviously, Indian women existed much more in relation to Indian men. I'm not looking at that. There are a whole set of issues about that as well, about how Indian women become the holders of culture. Look at me in the shalwar kameez. You go to an Indian wedding, women will be wearing traditional clothes, the men will be wearing European clothes, women are the holders of culture. But there are books. I mean, I wrote a dissertation, Michael Motherson Datta, who was a contemporary of Tagore, and he wrote some comedies in which there are very strong Indian women, in Purdah quite often. So yes, this is only part of the story.
There is a good book called as Begums of Bhopal. Begums of Bhopal, the queens of Bhopal. So there were quite a lot of generations of women rulers of this princely state.
Write it down, thank you.
Sure. There's one question at the back.
So what is your view on the archives that are being held, and why in these archives are there less or no women's voices?
I think part of it is because
Totally Western as well.
I think part of it is when the women were literate, obviously they weren't generally literate in English, they were literate in, an Asian language. But it's interesting because with Khairul Nissa, she clearly did write letters because there are references to those letters. Now, what seems to have happened is that those letters were destroyed because she had a later relationship, which didn't result in marriage, and female members of her second lover's family essentially destroyed those letters because they told a story they didn't want to be told. I haven't looked in detail. I have to say, I mean, the archives in the British Library from the East India Company are huge. There are wills, Indian women's wills that tell you a little bit about them. There aren't, as I say, as from what I understand, an awful lot of those materials. Though having said that, I haven't actually looked. But I know William Dalrymple did look at it, in extensive detail for stories, for these letters of Khairul Nissa and couldn't find them, though he could quite often find references to them. So I think, I don't know, I mean, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but were letters destroyed possibly, if they told a story that didn't fit a particular viewpoint or narrative? And I think there are probably less sources anyway.
Right.
Just wanted to make a comment. I actually saw this painting at the National Gallery.
Oh, is that where it is?
Dublin,
Okay.
It's very striking in a room full of pictures of mainly men to see this painting of an Asian...
Well, actually, one of the stories in here is called The Gallery,
Yeah.
and it's actually a vocalisation of Jamdani. I'm glad you told me it's the National Gallery, because all these people are going to see this picture, and she's talking about her life. It becomes clear that it's her because she talks about her lawyer, and she actually died in childbirth.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting story because it gives you the story behind the picture, because she's not even looking at us. So it's a very, very interesting story.
Could I just ask a question? So what happened to women like her? So they were mistresses. Where did they sit in society? Did they sit? What did their own people say about them, or did they fit in another arena altogether? What happened to them?
It's interesting because Khairul Nissa, for example, James Fitzpatrick built a huge kind of residency house, and he had Purdah quarters for her. So quite often these aristocratic women who formed liaisons with these English men replicated their lives before. She was. They kept their religious beliefs. They kept Purdah. But they didn't. They certainly didn't socialise with the EIC officials. So, for example, if James Fitzpatrick had some sort of dinner party with the EIC officials and their wives. his wife, Kiara Nissa, wouldn't have been present at that. But these other women, Jamdani, women of the, for want of a better word, of the lower kind of classes, they did mix. So this letter of William Hickey's friends makes it clear that he had come, seen this woman. I mean, this woman was William Hickey knew this woman because she had earlier been the lover of a friend of his, right? He'd seen her. So clearly there was a certain amount of, toing and froing. Again, it's not completely sort of clear, because when men became friends, they had things in common. So, for example, I was saying James Fitzpatrick had this relationship with this Indian aristocratic woman. William Palmer also had a relationship with an Indian aristocratic woman. The two men became friends, and then their wives began to meet. But that was in a personal capacity rather than in their diplomatic capacity, if you like. So I think they... It depends, essentially, where the woman came from, who she was seeing.
Can I just add something?
Yeah,
Just for information, William Hawkins, the first East India Company officer to travel to the Mughal court in 1608, he married an Indian lady. While he was in Mughal court, the Emperor Jahangir, he didn't want to let him go. So he made him, like one of his officers, gave him a rank and certain salary. And Jahangir kept him in the court in Agra for nearly 3 years. And he kind of pressured William Hawkins to get married. He first offered him a Muslim woman. He said she would convert to Christianity, according to William Hawkins, but he said no, he don't want to marry a Muslim woman. So he found an Indian Christian lady, right? And then later on he did take her out to the country. Then he died later on, and another East India Company officer married her, who was killed by the Dutch in the massacre in 1623. There's another woman, she's not Indian, but of the East India Company story. She was a Persian woman who was married to an Englishman, who was made the ambassador of Persia to England. And 12 boys of the East India Company was ordered to take him and his entire back to Persia. But then they couldn't land in Persia. Well, they did, but then they felt they were going to be killed by some conspiracy. They went to them and dropped them in near Sindh, Gujarat, around that time. There is quite a big in William Hawkins' account about his wife.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Thank you.
We are more affluent ladies that the East India Company white Nawabs married. What about the ones that they were from poorer families, poorer background?
Sorry, what's the question? What about the ones from the poor background?
Like when the East India Company sort of white Nawabs, when they married into like poorer Indian.
Well, the poorer women tended to be married by the poorer men. So, in fact, it tended to be the common rank and file soldiers. So there's a real class element in this, if you look at it, as well as a racial element, because men like William Palmer, James Kirkpatrick, they had mistresses that they treated quite badly, that were quite poor. Now, they didn't really treat them badly because they were Asian, or not just because they're Asian. They treated them badly because they were poor and Asian, in the way, I suppose, that men did in England as well. Whereas actually when poorer men married poorer women, they would leave their possessions to them, they would make financial provision for them. It kind of, if a poorer man set up a relationship with a poorer woman, that seemed to be very much more on a footing of equality than if a richer man set up a relationship with a poorer woman.
I heard about all these rich and powerful men. What about, I'm just asking you, you know, there is a called Anglo-Indian community. That's other than following his thing, that mostly I believe ordinary European with a local woman, and how they are. Can you tell about that?
Yeah, that's very interesting actually, because Anglo-Indians were the children of generally white men and Asian women, Indian women. And again, it's interesting what happened to the Anglo-Indian community, because again, it's at this time, certainly in the 18th century, things changed during the British Raj, and I'm not going to talk about that because my talk stops at 1850. What happened to the Anglo-Indian community to some extent depended upon class. So when James Fitzpatrick had 2 children, and when wealthy men formed relationships with wealthier women, and they had children, what they did, there was a lot of prejudice in India against Anglo-Indians. There was actually, bizarrely, less prejudice in England against Anglo-Indians. So what these men did is they shipped their children off. James Fitzpatrick actually shipped his 2 children off to his own father. They were brought up in England. His daughter was called Kitty Kirkpatrick. She married an English man in London, which she probably wouldn't have actually been able to do in India. So that was one way that the Anglo-Indian community was dealt with. The poorer Anglo-Indian community, it became much more of an issue as the British Raj took over, because there were punitive laws against them. At the beginning, in the 18th century, you had an advantage really, because the East India Company was trying to administer Indian states. If you were Anglo-Indian, you had a foot in both camps. You knew the languages, you knew the religions. You could find lucrative work. Now, when the British Raj, in fact before the British Raj, from the 1800s onwards, there were laws passed saying that Anglo-Indians couldn't be East India Company officials. There became much more of an awareness of racial hierarchies, and the Anglo-Indian community then became kind of, very much lost, because the English didn't want them, the Indians didn't see them as Indian, and so there were certain jobs they could do, railway workers. I think there were certain areas that they sort of worked in, and they lived together. They became their own community precisely because of that.
This is just a comment, because you are talking about this Shatidaho, burning the...
Oh, this Shatidaho.
This is, I read about a bit and did a bit of research. It was I thought it is the good work of the British. But actually Shatidaho Pratha is in India for a long time, and Mughals, Akbar state onwards, they tried to stop it, but they couldn't. But the all the credit mostly goes to the Raja Ram Mohan Rai. He started the movement, and due to his good work, mostly credit goes to him.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. I mean, again, it's the writing of British history that claims the credit for abolishing sati. But as you say, actually, this movement was started by an Indian man, Ram Mohan Roy, and actually the British were very reluctant originally to stop sati because they thought it would cause religious unrest.
Yes, exactly. So it is, if credit goes to anybody, he is one of the pioneers.
Thank you.
You mentioned the Leap Sings.
Mm-hmm.
His mother was well known, Jane Court.
Mm-hmm.
You said she was referred to as an nymphomaniac and nobody knew her name.
I said in that book she was referred to.
Book.
Yeah,
okay, I was going to say.
Yeah, no. Well, this is what I'm saying. These women are well known in certain contexts, but you read a history of the East India Company where Dulip Singh is mentioned, but his mother. I mean, there was a film recently about his mother. Yeah, exactly.
In the same way, they'll say that he was sent to Britain when actually he was kidnapped.
Yes, but
in the same way they say the Kohinoor was given to Queen Victoria when it was actually stolen.
But I think there is it's a different narrative. There is, but there is a different narrative about men and women, though. I think. I mean, I would say that there's a very different narrative about Indian women. They're skewed. All the narratives are skewed, but the particular narrative about Indian women does seem to obscure them. as you say, Dulip Singh's mother, was a lot of these women were prominent political figures. The Rani of Jhansi is most people from Bengal and India know about her, but you have a 400-page book on the East India Company that barely mentions her.
Well, as they say, the word, if you look at the word history, his
It's,
story.
absolutely,
His story,
yeah,
his
yeah,
story.
yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
One more of the invisible women that you're talking about with in the history of all of that time is everybody knows about Olivia Colman, the actress currently, and then she was tracing in one of the TV programs called Who Do You Think You Are? And she was tracing back her ancestry, and it happened to find that one of her great-great-great-grandmother may have been an Indian woman, and that particular grandfather was a military, an army man, and he was posted somewhere near Bangladesh, just between Bangladesh and Nepal, in this small country. And they went over there and to find this rural place, and it transpired that the Englishman took a native woman to be his partner, but in the records there's no mention of her. There's a child born and she was shipped off to England again, but there's absolutely no mention of who the mother of this child was, or where she came from. Nothing, absolutely nothing about her, and it just shows that that must have been so prolific.
And that was quite common, because that was quite common, this not mentioning the mother. The child would be mentioned, the name of the child, but the mother's name wouldn't be mentioned.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.